To introduce today's lecture, here is Dr. Paul Ducanois.
Thank you, Dr. McGreevy, and welcome to all this afternoon. I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Sean Foley, who comes to us today from Middle Tennessee State University, which is located near Nashville, Tennessee. Sean's a specialist in Middle Eastern history there and received his Ph.D. from Georgetown in 2005 and also received an MA prior to that in Arab Studies from Georgetown. I believe he defended his doctoral dissertation exactly 11 days before I did.
Yes.
Which makes him, of the two of us, the more senior scholar. Sean's forthcoming book is about the Arab states in the Persian Gulf region. As forthcoming from Lynne Rienner Press, this will be his first book, and his talk today will be from an material he did for an article forthcoming in the Journal of World History having to do with the Naqshbandiyya-Khalidiyya Sufi order, which was the topic of his doctoral dissertation. So, Dr. Foley, welcome to the American University of Beirut. It's a delight to have you, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be presenting a paper, may unlock this here, to be presenting here at the American University in Beirut, which has served for over a century as a critical bridge between the United States and the Middle East. As I remind all of my students in virtually every class that I give in the United States, more signatories to the United Nations Charter graduated from this institution, the American University in Beirut, than from any other university in the world. That's quite an achievement. In the fall of 1765, a young man visited the printing offices of the Virginia Gazette in Williamsburg, Virginia, and purchased this book that you see here, George Sale's English language translation of the central text of the Islamic faith, the Koran. The young man hoped that the sacred text and foundation of Islamic law would better help him understand how religious values transfer across cultures. In his eyes, the Stamp Act, recently imposed by Great Britain on colonial North Americans without their consent, undermined the heritage of English constitutional law and natural law as specified in the Koran here and in other scripture. Inspired in part by his reading of the Koran, this man that you see here, Thomas Jefferson, would pioneer a new conception of American liberty which would revolutionize the history of the United States and ultimately the world. While scholars have long recognized the importance of Islam to the Muslims generally, to the Balkans, and of course to Iberian history, there remains relatively limited scholarship on Islam's influence on men like Jefferson and on Euro-American societies generally before the 19th century. Exploring Islam's role in these societies is, of course, problematic because mainstream Euro-American conceptions of Islam have long been based on misconceptions or distortions, and because there have been relatively few recognizably Muslim communities in much of Europe and North America after 1500. Can we discuss Euro-American views of Islam without, for these purposes, referencing Western bigotry or imperialism? Isn't even misinformation a kind of information? Doesn't at least imply some sort of relationship? I believe that the answers to these questions is yes, and that exploring them allows us to see that the inheritance of the United States, the Americas, and Europe clearly extends to the Muslim world. Muslims were important members of a global community whose members and intellectual traditions left an important imprint on Europeans and their descendants, like Thomas Jefferson, in the Americas. That imprint provided the tableau for them not only to redefine their national identity and their own identity with the Islamic world, but also, more importantly, to define their own national identity and relationship to other Euro-American or Euro-Atlantic nations. Within this framework, Islamic identity and power function in much the same way that the concept of Tajdid, or renewal has for Muslims as an engine of social reform that has allowed societies to realize their core principles and values, particularly universal religious and political rights. Though the term Tajdid often refers to religious renewal, I will use it here as a term for social renewal, a meaning which Tajdid also incorporates. In this speech today, I will explore how this process of renewal occurred at three turning points in Euro-American history from the 15th century until the 18th century. First, the Reformation. Second, the rise of European nationalism. And third, the emergence of Anglo-American norms of natural law and universal human rights. Throughout these three periods, Muslim military and cultural power shaped religious, literary, and political discourse in Euro-Atlantic societies and won widespread respect for Muslims and their civilizations. Intellectuals as diverse as Martin Luther, John Locke, and Thomas Jefferson expended considerable energy educating themselves and others about Islam. They also employed Islam, like Jefferson here, and Muslims as a vehicle to justify reforms within their own societies. Finally, an analysis of these periods allows us to better place Muslims and their descendants within the history of Euro-American societies and ultimately within the contemporary world. Throughout the 6 centuries preceding Columbus's voyage in 1492 to the Americas, Islamic culture dominated the Mediterranean, Asia, and Africa, large portions, while Mongol and Crusader invasions and the Reconquista had without question tested Islamic power. No European state equaled the strength of many of the major early modern empires, Muslim empires, particularly the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire's armies had seized Constantinople, the ancient seat of Eastern Christianity, in 1453, after they had taken much of the rest of southeastern Europe in the 14th century. Thereafter, they expanded into the Balkans and Central Europe, seizing control of Hungary in 1526, and later besieging Vienna in 1529. For many Christian Europeans, Islamic expansion and the fall of Constantinople signaled God's displeasure with Christendom and the Catholic Church in particular. Among the most important of these individuals is the man that you see here, Martin Luther. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed 95 theses criticizing various aspects of the Catholic Church to the door of a Catholic church in Germany. That action symbolically began the Reformation, an event which reshaped European politics and eventually influenced societies throughout the Americas. As Luther criticized the Catholic Church, he simultaneously pioneered a new conception of Islam within an eschatological framework which reinforced his pastoral mission and called for his own form of Tajdid and renewal. While Edward Said has correctly identified similarities between Latin medieval thought and theologians in this man here, Luther, it's important to bear in mind that Luther lived in a time and a social-cultural context far removed from those theologians. For average Christian Europeans in the 16th century, who lived in a world in which Islam appeared ascendant and to hold God's favor, it was not enough for them, simply not enough to rehash old assertions that Islam was simply a Christian heresy. Luther here responded to these fears by asserting that the Ottomans, whom he mistakenly called the Turks, were agents of the devil, who, along with the Antichrist, which he argued was at the heart of the Catholic Church in Rome, would usher in the last days and eventually the apocalypse. In this environment, Luther warned that the chief danger for Christians would be that they would be fooled by the devil's agents and to convert to Islam in mass. He wrote, "Since we now have the Turk and his religion at our very doorstep, our people must be warned lest either they be moved by the splendor of the Turkish religion and the external appearance of their customs, or offended by the meager display of our faith or the deformity of our customs. They deny their Christ and follow Muhammad. And among those vulnerable to conversion and to the powers of the devil was again Martin Luther himself. He wrote in his selected Psalms, "Whoever is interested may earn a lesson from my example, which I shall now confess. A few times, when I did not bear this principal teaching in mind, the devil caught up with me and plagued me with scriptural passages until heaven and earth became too small for me. Then all the words of law and men were right, and not an error was to be found in the whole papacy. In short, the only one who had ever erred was Luther. All my best works, teachings, sermons, and books had to be condemned. The abominable Muhammad almost became my prophet, and both Turks and Jews were on their way to pure sainthood." Now, when thinking about this passage, it's significant to recall that Luther's concerns with Islam were not just grounded solely in the craftiness of the devil or even the Turks. As he clearly indicates, they also reflected his belief that Europe's Catholic theologians were too intellectually or spiritually weak to protect ordinary Europeans from the allure of Islam. Luther supported these actions remarkably by distributing Islamic texts, including the Koran, and the works of Europeans who had visited Muslim territories. This was an extraordinary, unusual step anywhere in 16th century Europe, where both Protestant and Catholic communities routinely banned any text dealing with Islam as a threat to Christianity. Luther had to use considerable political pressure in 1542 when he maneuvered the city council of Basel to lift its long-standing ban on publishing his preferred translation of the Koran. Nor did Luther's interest in Islam go unnoticed by his adversaries in the Catholic Church. Throughout the first half of the 16th century, various Catholic thinkers sought to prove that there were close similarities between the ideas of Martin Luther and others in the Protestant community and Islam in areas as diverse as freedom of worship and the celibacy of priests. Other writers stressed that the Ottoman Sultan in the first half of the 16th century, Suleiman the Magnificent, saw this man, Luther, as a valuable ally to the empire's cause. While Catholic criticism certainly attributed views to Luther he did not hold, he nonetheless believed it necessarily to publicly beseech God from ever having to live under Suleiman's rule. In light of these criticisms, why did Luther and his contemporaries, who were already challenging the legitimacy of the chief religious institution in Europe, the Catholic Church, invest time and their resources in promoting knowledge about Islam, Christendom's chief enemy? The answer is that demonstrating Islam's strength and superiority over Roman Catholicism was central to the key tenets of Luther's views and his argument. The Catholic Church, in his eyes, was not fit to lead Christendom, and the success of the Ottomans was God's way of articulating his desire for Europeans to repent and to reform. For Luther, understanding Islam offered the surest path for Christian Europeans to see the veracity of his contention regarding the spiritual and moral bankruptcy of the Catholic Church's leaders and the urgent need for Christendom to renew their faith and to adopt new leadership. Now, Ottoman power also drove important changes in other parts of Europe as well in the 16th and the 17th centuries, contributing to the rise of nation-states and two new national identities in two key ways. First, the Ottoman Empire's presence, this large green here, in Europe, allowed countries from England up there in the north all the way to the Balkans to use the Ottoman Empire's power and presence as a tool to balance out seemingly stronger Christian powers in their area, like Spain or Austria. That's the first way it was key. The second way this process unfolded was that Muslim mariners, often allied with the Ottoman Empire, besieged significant portions of the coast of Europe. These attacks decimated these regions. They undermined the authority of some governments. They would help redefine national identities and would compel governments in places like France to extend unprecedented rights and guarantees to their subjects, rights which became the cornerstone of what we know today as the Euro-Atlantic legal tradition. Now, this two-track process began in Germany, this sort of area over here, where the simultaneous challenges of the Ottoman Empire and the Protestant Reformation challenged the resources of even Europe's strongest Catholic monarchs, people like Spain here, as well as in Spain there, as well as in Austria as well. And in this process, as it would develop, European monarchs would face this potential problem. On multiple occasions, including periods when the Ottoman Empire seemingly threatened the heart of Europe, Protestant states refused to participate in military operations against the Ottoman Empire until all religious issues had been resolved. For all their power and their wealth, Charles V of Spain and Ferdinand I of Austria had no choice but to negotiate directly with weaker German states and respect their religious views, no matter how objectionable they may have appeared to Catholic audiences. This was a major blow to states which saw themselves as absolute monarchies beholden to no one except God. Nor were Catholic resources stretched only in Germany. In its many protracted conflicts with Spain's many protracted conflicts with France, England, and the Netherlands, the Spanish crown always had to allow for the fact of the ability of the Ottoman Empire to attack its targets far removed from Western Europe. For example, the Dutch Republic that you see up there used trade with the Ottoman markets to circumvent a Spanish embargo on Dutch trade with Iberia, an embargo meant to punish Holland for seeking independence from the Spanish crown. Thanks in part to Ottoman markets and military assistance, the Dutch won their independence in 1609. Protestant England and Catholic France, those two states, also used Ottoman power as a vehicle to assert their national identity and interest against Spanish power in Europe. In one instance, Spain was compelled to release France's king, Francis I, shortly after Spanish armies had seized him in 1525. This man, Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, had signaled his desire for the immediate release of the French king. Subsequently, Francis admitted to a Venetian diplomat that he saw the Ottoman Empire as the only force guaranteeing the combined existence of the states of Europe against Spanish power. And to give you an idea about sort of what Ottoman power meant, let me tell you a story. You can actually see this on a video you have in your library called Suleiman the Magnificent. The story goes like this. It's a letter that's recalled on that video. When Francis was captured, he got his mother, gave him a note, and that note was sent out and reached Suleiman. Suleiman sent an official response. In the response, he begins by saying, "I am Sultan Suleiman, the shadow of God on earth," and lists dozens of lands that he controls, and says, "I have received the letter from you, Francis I, king of the province of France." It's an amazing thing to say. In the rest of the letter, it gets far worse for Francis. Suleiman gives him monarchical advice. It's not advice of equals. It's advice of a parent gently trying to control a recalcitrant child. It's an amazing amount. You can see in that context the power that Suleiman had and the Ottoman Empire had over even the strongest European monarchs like Francis. And Suleiman and his successors' ability to strike at Spanish possessions far removed from Eastern Europe again reflected his large army, but also the formal and informal naval power of the empire. Between 1500 and 1800, North African mariners here raided and seized over 1 million Europeans from the eastern Mediterranean coast here of Italy, all the way up beyond England, all the way to Iceland, all the way that far up. And as they began to do so, as they wreaked havoc, it's worth noting that this issue of Muslim enslavement on Europeans remained an issue well after the Ottoman losses at Lepanto and elsewhere in the 16th and 17th centuries, losses which some historians argue hastened the decline of the Ottoman Empire and its eventual collapse in the 20th century. Among the Europeans taken during this time was the Spanish author Miguel de Cervantes. He was a leading figure in Spain's 16th century cultural flourishing, the Siglo de Oro, and contributed to the country's emerging national identity. His captivity in Algiers from 1575 to 1580 was a key turning point in his literary career, as well as an inspiration for Don Quixote, one of the major texts of the Western literary canon. European captives, Muslim attacks, and the publicity surrounded to them also sparked national consciousness, new national missions, and ultimately social change in both England and in France. In both countries, this process cemented the principle that only non-Europeans should be enslaved, and as such, they glorified free labor and efforts to combat Muslim slavery. One can see this notion as early as Shakespeare's depiction of a key moment in English history. Henry V's victory in 1420 over the French and his marriage proposal to Princess Catherine, the daughter of the King of France. And in this scene that I will read, Henry tries to win Catherine's heart by promising her that their future son will liberate Constantinople from the Ottomans. "If thou ever be'st mine, Kate, as I have a saving faith," he's telling her, "within me tells me thou shalt. I get thee with scambling, and thou must therefore needs prove a good soldier breeder. Shall not thou and I, between St. Denis and St. George, compound a boy, half French, half English, that shall go to Constantinople and take the Turk by the beard?" Yet it's unlikely that Henry ever made such a promise. Why? Because the Ottoman Empire did not seize Constantinople until 1453, 3 decades before Henry made his promise to Catherine in 1420. Nonetheless, the story or myth of Henry's promise to Catherine was so significantly important to English national consciousness and identity by the 16th century that Shakespeare felt compelled to use it in his play on Henry's life, and it's regardless of its historical validity. Literary masterpieces such as Henry V bear testimony to the need of the English, even at their most intense moments of periods of nationalism, to define themselves against the Muslim world. Now, the Islamic element or character of English national consciousness, as evidenced in Henry V, grew still stronger in the 17th century, as Muslim maritime attacks challenged the cornerstone of the island nation's national mythology. For the English, the ocean was the source of England's economic, political, and military vitality. The Stuart kings' failure to stop Muslim attacks and enslavement of Englishmen was a factor that robbed them of legitimacy and helped to provoke civil wars that tore England and the adjacent countries apart after 1642. Subsequent English kings prudently sought to avoid the Stuarts' fate by strengthening the English navy, paying Muslims not to enslave Englishmen on the high seas, and pledging to prevent further enslavement of Englishmen. By the 18th century, this national mission had become institutionalized, as evidenced by the words of James Thomson's poem, "Rule Britannia." Rule Britannia, rule the waves. Britons never will be slaves. Now, across the Channel in France, Muslim mariners' attacks and enslavement of Christian Europeans in the Mediterranean also led to significant changes in how the French conceived of their relationship to their central government and their basic rights as subjects of the French king. Before the late 17th century, French monarchs routinely ignored the plight of French men and women held in captivity in North Africa. Those there who were caught in slavery in North Africa could only seek the aid of prominent families in their home communities in France, or possibly chambers of commerce and other local administrative institutions. Although the French upheld the principle that all free people in the kingdom were guaranteed freedom, the phrase was, "There are no slaves in France." In reality, a French captive's ability to secure freedom from slavery in North Africa hinged on his or her particular local identity and social role in France, rather than on his or her national identity as French. But the publicity surrounding Muslim captives and the growing might of the French state in the Mediterranean made it appear that the enslavement of Frenchmen was no longer purely a local concern. It was now seen as a great affront to the French monarch's power and his glory. During the final years of Louis XIV's rule and those of his successors, the French state paid ransoms and took ever-aggressive measures using the most advanced technology and weapons against Muslim states to protect its people and to free French captives. By doing so, Louis and his successors solidified two principles of French law and later Euro-Atlantic life. First, all subjects of the state were guaranteed freedom, no matter what their geographic origin. Second, it was the responsibility of the state to guarantee that freedom. It no longer mattered in France where you were from or what your social role was. And out of these promises, in part, would emerge French national identity. Those principles also would play an integral role into groundbreaking social political movements in the Euro-Atlantic, in which Islam was an important factor. The rise of notions of universal human rights in the English-speaking Atlantic world, and the war of the American Revolution. For philosophers like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, Muslims were not a signal of God's disfavor or a serious strategic threat requiring national unity or effective state action. Instead, Muslims functioned as a central element in a political debate and called for social renewal, or Tajdid, in which their inclusion in Euro-Atlantic society demonstrated the universality of human rights and political freedoms. At first glance, Islam's centrality to a political debate originating in the English-speaking Europe and North America might come as a bit of a surprise. While many of the leaders who would lead European expansion and exploration in the Americas had experience finding Muslim and brought some Muslim farming techniques to the British North America, Muslims lacked a presence in places like in the colonies that you see here in North America, equivalent to the one that they maintained in the Mediterranean. American coastal settlements were never attacked by Muslim mariners. Muslim populations were overwhelmingly slaves and situated in the southern states, places like North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, it's true in places like Charlestown and South Carolina and several other cities in places like Georgia right below it, one could find people who spoke Arabic, and some Muslims continued to perform recognizably Islamic rituals, such as fasting during Ramadan, well into the colonial and later periods. But despite these several instances I've just given to you, there were very few identifiably Muslim communities in the Carolinas, Georgia, or actually anywhere else in British colonial North America. But the absence of a clear Muslim presence, however, did not mean that Anglophile North Americans were unaware of Islam. The accounts of Europeans and even some Americans enslaved in Muslim societies, Protestant sermons, and other writings on Islam gave Anglo-Americans the confidence that they, like Martin Luther, had sufficient knowledge of Islam to use it as a tool to establish the superiority of their own faith and to fend off all other challengers, including Islam. References to Muslims pepper the public documents of early colonial America and were central to the collective identity of colonial Americans. For them, Americans and Protestant Christians lived in free societies and were entitled to liberty, while Muslims lived in despotic societies which hindered liberty and progress and were defined by one thing: slavery. The once flourishing societies of the Muslim Middle East provided a cautionary tale for any American. They demonstrated what could happen if the progress of liberty were ever hindered. As Timothy Marr and other scholars have noted, this outdated Orientalist perspective continues to define much of the contemporary American discussion of Islam and Muslim societies. Such Orientalist beliefs, though, allowed colonial Americans to maintain their prejudices, no question. But even misinformation may retain an element of truth, of information. At least colonial Americans were not ignorant completely of Islam. Jefferson would have never purchased George Sale's English language translation of the Koran had he not read Friar von Pufendorfer's Of the Law and Nature of Nations, which observes that the Koran's teachings on murder, revenge, and a host of other issues are consistent with Greco-Roman beliefs and natural law. In addition, Sale, in the introduction to the Koran, which Jefferson bought, argues that gaining an understanding to the Koran constituted an important element of contemporary knowledge. He notes, to be acquainted with the various law and constitution of civilized nations, like the Koran, especially those who flourish in our own time, is perhaps the most useful part of knowledge. Nor were Sale's arguments or a positive view of Islam uncommon or necessarily antithetical to mainstream Euro-American thought in either the 17th or the 18th centuries. Europeans may have certainly not considered Islam equal to Christianity, but they certainly viewed its achievements and its urban civilization with enormous respect, if not awe, at times. The English lexicographer, Dr. Samuel Johnson, articulated this viewpoint. He said there are two objects of curiosity in the world: the Christian world and the Muslim or Mohammedan world. All the rest may be considered as barbarous. In a letter concerning toleration, this man that you see here, the 17th century philosopher John Locke, went so far as to argue that Muslims should not be excluded from enjoying English civil rights solely because of their religion, a right, it should be noted, he did not extend to Catholics. Locke's words reflected his own acquaintance with Islam. He read Arabic, owned a Koran, and knew leading English Arabists. As Jefferson sought to reconcile natural law with the Stamp Act, he embraced the vision of Islam advocated by Locke to cement his vision and his own vision of social reform. He learned Arabic, purchased a translation of the Koran, and befriended two leading Arabic scholars of his day, C.F. Foley and Samuel Henley. Jefferson's Notes on Religion in 1773 directly quotes Locke's assertion that Muslims should not be denied their civil rights solely because of their religious beliefs. Jefferson applied similar values when he proposed Virginia's bill for establishing religious freedom in 1779. Decades after the bill became law, Jefferson recalled in his memoirs that the bill protected the rights of the Jew, the Gentile, and the infidel, and the Muslim of every denomination. Together, Jefferson's Notes on Religion and his comments on the bill for establishing religious freedom signal a conscious inclusion of Muslims in his notion of toleration and political equality, what was the basis of his ideas. Jefferson's universalist vision of human rights challenged the Anglo-American principle that freedoms flowed from a specific group's identity. Remember Thompson's poem. The phrase said, "Britons never will be slaves." Jefferson here did not believe that Americans were free because they were Americans or Protestant Christians. he could not credibly claim that the values he promoted were truly universal unless he showed that they applied to Muslims and to other men. For Jefferson, deconstructing Orientalist constructs was a precondition for the success of liberty in the United States. For him, it was self-evident that all men are created equal. Jefferson's universalist vision of equality and human rights subsequently emerged in this document, the chief political document of his lifetime, the U.S. Constitution. Not only did the Constitution, which was adopted in 1787, guarantee religious liberty to American citizens, it also provided a right which many state constitutions at the time did not. It permitted all free men, regardless of their religious affiliation, to hold any federal or state office. The second clause of Article 4 mandated that no religious test shall be required as qualification for any office or public trust under the United States. Instead, the first clause of the third section of Article 6 of the document stipulated that all U.S. senators and representatives, members of state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officials, both of the United States and of the states, shall be bound by an oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. There is no specific mention of religion at all. The U.S. Constitution had codified Jefferson's conception of human rights, a conception that went beyond anything conceived of by Locke. Muslims and other non-Protestant Christians were no longer just tolerated. They could be full citizens and participate in the highest levels of American political life, including, conceivably, the presidency. Nearly 2 centuries after Jefferson's death, Americans continue to grapple with the implications of his vision. President-elect Barack Obama exemplifies Jefferson's vision, a vision of a multi-religious society in which people of every creed and ancestry, including Islam, can hold elected office. If we look for the roots of what the African-American author Ishmael Reed calls multi-America, we can see them in the works of Thomas Jefferson. It was only fitting that you see here that Keith Ellison, the first Muslim ever elected to the United States Congress, swore his oath to the Constitution on Jefferson's copy of the Koran when he was sworn into office in January 2007. Yet it's important to remember that the use of Islam to justify social change and political reform in Europe and America predates the third U.S. president and author of the Declaration of Independence by centuries. Muslims had occupied significant portions of Europe since the Middle Ages. They had contributed to the continent's socio-economic development and figured prominently in European religious and political discourse. The Ottoman seizure of Constantinople and southeastern Europe helped to set the stage for the Protestant Reformation, along with the European expansion into the Atlantic world. Columbus's voyage and its results simply extended the Muslim-Christian interaction that had begun hundreds of years earlier in Iberia, North Africa, and elsewhere in the Mediterranean. It is, to use Jefferson's phrase, self-evident that Muslims, their intellectual tradition, and descendants deserve an equal place in any vision of European and of American history. At the same time, it is worth noting that Jefferson's use of Islam to promote a vision of Tajdid coincided with a critical transformation among Muslims themselves. For centuries, Muslims had used Tajdid to meet the changing needs of their societies and to return to the prophetic ideal. But after the mid-18th century and into the 19th century, Muslims sought to use Tajdid for a new purpose, to reconstruct Muslim societies in accordance with a rediscovered true Islam. The agenda would soon be called Islamic modernism. The motivating factor in the emergence of Islamic modernism was the rise of Europe. Its ideas, power, and institutions profoundly impacted Muslim views of themselves and their religion. The impact of Europe took two forms. The first was intellectual. Muslims sought to reconcile Islam with modern science and politics and to reconcile religion as an ideology. The second was organizational. Tajdid in the 20th century increasingly took on the form of mass political movements based on a European or Western model. Its structure grew more centralized, and its leaders utilized European forms of mass media. Islamic modernism would fail in its political objective of reconstructing Muslim societies as they once were. But it would set the stage for new Tajdid movements, which in some respects would reject Western values and objectives, but implicitly in others incorporate Western modes of thought, institutions, and technology. We're still seeing the results of this process unfold throughout the Islamic world. Since the horrific events of September 11, 2001, as many of you know, the Middle East and the Islamic world have entered the consciousness of all Americans. Alas and unfortunately, much of the discussion generated by this tragedy has taken place in the realm of ignorance and fear. Influence of the West on Islam. How many books can you find that are published in a given week, no less month, year, or decade, that have that as their thesis? What I'm arguing is maybe we need to step back and take a look and say, it's a two-way street. That it's both going on in that context. No, I'm not defending that at all. That's what I'm hitting at.
I have a question.
Yep.
I thought it was very interesting that the map you put up was 1648.
Right.
And so my question has to do with the development of the modern state system in Europe, which that year is an important year, obviously. And what's interesting to me is what shifts between the role of non-Christians in 1648. Because before 1648, you have an international Catholic Church, or an international kind of Christianity, which is it's a political force as well as a religious force. And then you also have Jewish people who are scattered about Europe. And I know that there are some perceptions that Jews could sometimes be seen as kind of an internal group that threatened Christianity, and sometimes accused of being in league with this outside group, which was obviously the big enemy, and of course even the fact that you would accept them in Constantinople or in Istanbul could be a hint that, aha, the Jews and the Muslims are in league against Christianity. But then suddenly you have this switch where you're having states, and each state is going to agree that we will have our national religion that is our official religion, and you will have yours, and then eventually we will even begin to treat our minorities within our states, the Protestants in France eventually, and then eventually you get the United States, which literally says we do not have an official religion. So what happens to, and then of course with nationalism, we have this problem of the Jews, the Jewish question. Once you've got nationalism emerging in Europe, then you have all these people who are not confined to any one country, and therefore they can be seen as dangerous. And so what I'm wondering is what happens to the perception of the Muslim world when we switch into this world of states?
Well, certainly there are a couple things. First, in terms of when we think about the difference between the United States and Europe, lots of people leave the United States. Europe to the United States. And so a lot of this sort of ideas and political traditions that would emerge as dominant in the United States were minority or positions that lost in Europe. When we talk about particularly religious traditions and differences between the idea, people are leaving Europe who want to have a minority religious opinion. When they get to the Americas, the idea is that they want an environment that's going to protect that religion and that religious minority, and they don't want to have a state tradition. That's part and parcel of the process. People leave. This is part of the difference between, when we talk about the West, between the fundamental differences between America and the United States, America and Europe. But it's also noted when we think about it, look at the development of the positive frame into the 17th and 18th century. And in the 17th and 18th century, Muslims begin to be adopted in certain ways. There are ways of looking at Muslims differently, particularly as they're less of direct threat as the Ottoman Empire, although it's still an important threat on a strategic calculations into the 18th century. It does develop into a framework in which it's no longer the fear of Islam that's going to generate understanding. You know, what is said in 17th and 18th centuries about Islam, the idea there are two objects of curiosity. One is Christendom, the other one is the Muslim world. Comes out of that tradition. Comes out of a world in which the direct threat is less pertinent in that way.
No other questions? Thank you very much.